Hey guys, hi. This is Payal Chakravarti. I am on the PM team at Sysdig, working on Sysdig Monitor. And one of the topics that I want to talk to you about today is some of the changes that we're making to how we group and scope the data that we have in Sysdig Monitor. It's a very important piece of information. It's a decision that will make our product much better, faster, and more accurate, precise, and robust. Let's start with the purpose of simplifying the grouping and scopes is to actually enable users to get more precise data. It'll be much more robust. You'll see less of no data available or not applicables in your environment. With that in mind, we've put in certain changes, and this has implications on how you will use the product. I've been talking about grouping and scopes, so let me just refresh everybody's knowledge on what we mean by those terminologies. In Sysdig, we have three fundamental concepts: groupings, scope, and segmentation. Grouping is a hierarchical aggregation. It looks something like this in Sysdig. So if you go to explore, you can select a set of labels and you can create a hierarchy in a particular order. A scope is to filter the data. So when you search for something or when you create a dashboard panel or edit an alert, you enter a scope for the data, right? So this is what it looks like. It's a set of labels and operators and values. And by stitching those together, you can filter your data and say, okay, alert me on containers where my agent tag role is web server and my container image is WordPress. So that's scoping. And segmentation, it allows you to take the data and do a multi-series comparison. So let's say you're looking at CPU usage, you can say segment by container ID, and then instead of seeing one single line, you'll see multiple lines, each line representing a single container. These are the three fundamental concepts and some of the nuances that are changing to make these better. So first and foremost, enabling logical hierarchies and grouping. What this means is that when I say grouping, grouping involves a hierarchy. Like for example, hosts and containers. Host name followed by container ID is a hierarchy. That's a very valid hierarchy. But in our product today, we allow a lot of arbitrary hierarchies. And that leads to inaccurate data. For example, you cannot have a host name after a pod name, right? Because a pod usually runs on the host. So that hierarchy doesn't make sense. Or you could not have a node name before a deployment name. Deployment could run across multiple nodes. So you'd end up getting inaccurate data there. However, the last two, like pod name, container ID, or a cluster name followed by node, followed by pod, is absolutely valid. So what you're going to see in the product is when you are building these groupings in Explore, labels will always be filtered based on the previous selection. And we're going to be removing some of these arbitrary hierarchies that we allowed in the past. And I'll demonstrate that to you in a bit. Now, what does this logical hierarchy look like? So let's take Kubernetes as an example. It's an example everybody understands. So you could go from a cluster to a node to a pod to a container. You could go from a cluster to a namespace to a service to a pod, or namespace to a deployment to replica set to a pod. You could go to a daemon set or a job. Note that you could skip any of the intermediate steps. So you could go from namespace to deployment to pod, skipping the replica set altogether. Or you could go from namespace to replica set to pod with skipping the deployment altogether. All those are allowed. So the intermediate steps you could skip, but you cannot go in the reverse order. So you cannot go from pod to back to namespace, right? You can't have pod and then select a namespace. That wouldn't work. The other thing that's notable here is Kubernetes objects like namespace, deployment, pods are all based on container labels, right? So when you have anything related to a container, we can roll it up to any of these Kubernetes levels. However, host is not really a Kubernetes object. So there are many host level metrics that apply only to a host. For example, host count, right? Number of hosts, or load averages, or CPU cores. There's certain things which may be applicable only to the host, and that will not be visible to the Kubernetes objects, right? So you don't have a one-on-one correlation there. And it's better not to mix and match those because that data will be inaccurate if you have done that today. However, there are some relations which are valid, like for example, you could segment by the host name, and those will continue to work. Now, let's look at the next big change, which is your metrics and dashboards will be filtered by the scope selected. And this is particularly applicable for some of the new dashboards and metrics we're introducing, like cube state metrics. An example here is that host count is not applicable to Kubernetes pod name or container ID. So you can't say, show me the container ID and show me the number of host count for it. It's just completely inaccurate. So in that case, if you're looking at the metric host count or looking at a dashboard that has that metric, and you select a row in your Explore that metric doesn't apply to, you will see a message that says, this dashboard or this metric is not applicable to your selection. Earlier, what we would do is, firstly, we would allow you to select any of these, right? Secondly, we would just show you no data available on the panels. So we are cleaning that up so that you know what is applicable to what, and give you an explicit message of why you're not seeing the dashboard, and helping you feel much more gracefully and understanding the reason behind it. An extension of this is, in the previous slide, I was talking about you can select a row in Explore. So you're selecting the scope, and the dashboards and metrics would get filtered based on it. It can happen the other way around also. What I mean by that is, in a dashboard panel or in an alert editor, if you've entered a metric, then your scope and segmentation that you see will be based on the metric selected. So we will be filtering the scope and segmentation list as well based on the metric selected. And if you have an invalid selection, you will be given a visual indication. Your charts will continue to work, but if you try to edit it, it will give you a visual indication that this is not valid, right? You probably want to change this segmentation, or you want to change the scope. That will give you much more accurate data. Some of the examples, as I was saying, host count is not applicable to container ID. Also, a deployment replicas desired is a deployment level metric. It tells you how many replicas are desired for that deployment. So it doesn't apply to the pod. So that metric will not be applicable to a pod name. You will see these restrictions. We're giving you visual indications in the UI to tell you that, this is invalid, and your existing charts will continue to work, but we encourage you to go and change it with the valid segments and scopes so that you get the most accurate data. And of course, this will happen if you have built charts and alerts around things that don't really follow a logical pattern or logical scope. And then the last one is the new cube state metrics that we are introducing are applicable only to pure Kubernetes groupings. What I mean by that is that if you have a grouping that has kubernetes.star in each of the labels in the hierarchy, then it's a valid pure Kubernetes grouping. If you mix and match them, we're not going to be able to report cube state metrics in an accurate way. We are introducing new groupings as well. So we encourage you to just use default groupings or a grouping that has Kubernetes.star. One of the most common use cases that I've seen for people mixing and matching is using something called agent, like a cluster, to indicate what cluster the Kubernetes belongs to. Now we've introduced in our product Kubernetes cluster name and cluster ID. So with those new labels, you don't need to use your agent tag cluster anymore. And if you still want to use a specific value from one of your tags, you could go into the YAML file and change Kubernetes cluster.name to point to whatever tag you care about, and that would start showing up in the UI. You will have all the flexibility to see the data the way you want. We're trying to follow a logical path and restrict you in certain ways, but the restriction is based on logic and sense so that you don't end up looking at inaccurate data. One of the key things, there is some action associated with this. We're not going to break existing things. We'll give you time. It'll take 90 days to change your grouping hierarchies if you are not following them. You can still use your existing hierarchies, just the data that you may see will not be always accurate. So we encourage you to follow the logical path to have your grouping hierarchies modified to adhere to these new rules. We've looked at a lot of groupings that users have created from the data. We haven't seen a lot of unnatural ones. I think with all the changes we introduced, they're all going to be pretty standard for you to change. The second thing is, use your visual guidance to change your scope and segments in your dashboards and alerts if needed. And that'll happen only if you have created things in the past that don't really adhere to the right way of filtering and segmenting. And also, just so you know, customer success is always there. You can live chat with customer success at any point if you have any questions. If there are certain hierarchies or scope, segmentation, grouping that really makes sense to you and you want to retain them, you can reach out to us. I'll be very happy to talk to you and see how we can accommodate what you want to do in a meaningful way. All right, having said that, let me jump into a demo to show you what these changes look like. For example, first and foremost, you will see a bunch of new groupings that we've introduced just to make your life easier. For example, this is a common one where you have the cluster ID, namespace, deployment pod, container. Now let's start with the deployments and pods. You will notice I changed this to a service. You see that what I had before went away. So I couldn't have a deployment after the service. If you revert back, you see that namespace, deployment pod, container. If I introduce service here, the deployment goes away. So you cannot select deployment from here. And it follows that logical hierarchy, that diagram that I was showing you before. So if you have a grouping like that, which doesn't make sense, you will still see it, but you should follow that hierarchy to go change it. For example, here in your settings, you will see a toggle called Allow Ad Hoc Hierarchies and Grouping. If you enable this, when you go back, you can actually have a service followed by a deployment name thing that I was trying to do that doesn't work. So you can have that turned on by default to have all the arbitrary hierarchies you have today. Follow the diagram, follow the path to change them, and then go to settings, turn off the toggle, and then test it out to make sure you're not breaking your hierarchies. So let's pick one of the out-of-the-box grouping hierarchies and show you the second thing that I was telling you, that when you select a particular scope in Explore table, when you select a row, you will see the dashboards and metrics in context of what you selected. So I'm looking at my new cube state dashboards, for example. If I have selected, let's say, a deployment dashboard, right? And I'm looking at a namespace, that's fine. I can looking at a deployment, that's fine. But if I try to go to a pod, it will tell me that the deployment state dashboard is not applicable to a pod. So, and you'll also see the list of dashboards and metrics getting filtered based on what you've selected. Now, caveat is right now, this filtering is done for certain dashboards and alerts. We do this right now for the out-of-the-box dashboards and metrics, but we have not yet implemented the same thing for custom metrics, but that work is underway as well. So in the future, you will also see filtering of your custom metrics that you see here based on what you select in Explore table. The other thing that I would like to show you is when you have a dashboard where this new segmentation or scope is not applicable, you will see that visually indicated by this red alert, and it'll tell you, you have an invalid configuration, your settings may have changed, click here for more details to see more information. So this is another visual guidance we are providing you in your dashboards. Last but not the least, actually, was the pure Kubernetes groupings. Anything that uses a kubernetes.star, this is a pure Kubernetes grouping, and you can see Kubernetes state or kube state dashboards and metrics here. Now, if I change this to something arbitrary like an agent tag, if you do that, you'll see that kube state dashboards and metrics are not available anymore. The Kubernetes state folder itself disappears. If you switch to one of the pure groupings, you'll see those available. So these are the 4 high-level key changes. As I said, the settings is available for you. You can turn on or off that toggle to play with these changes. There's live chat. You can reach out to us at any time. And you will have 90 days to go in and make these changes in especially your grouping hierarchies. That's the most important one, I would say. All right, that's all I have. Thank you.